Can Francis Ngannou become a good professional boxer? This is the immediate question I asked myself as soon as Francis Ngannou dropped the bombshell of an announcement that he will no longer be a part of the UFC and possibly pursue professional boxing. Obviously, there's been some rumors that he may face Tyson Fury. This stems back from when Tyson Fury first called out Francis Ngannou after his fight against Dillian Whyte and brought him into the ring to possibly set up and hype up a matchup between the two. But the obvious question is, will Francis Ngannou translate into boxing well, and will he become a good professional boxer? Well, in this video, I'll hopefully try to answer this question and find out if Francis Ngannou can actually compete with some of the top guys in the heavyweight division in boxing. Well, let's start off with some of the positives for Francis Ngannou and why he can be a good professional boxer. One being his primary style is boxing, and he originally was supposed to be a boxer and not a UFC fighter. In past interviews, Francis Ngannou has detailed that when he came to France as an immigrant from Cameroon, he originally aspired to be a professional boxer, but because he had the opportunity to become a professional MMA fighter quicker, he opted for that route.
Wanted so bad to do sport, and I was doing boxing and MMA. But the MMA was the one that was more open and giving me opportunity.
Then just 8 years later, he would knock out one of the greatest heavyweights of all time in the UFC, in Stipe Miocic, and finally become the UFC heavyweight champion of the world. But during that 8-year span between his debut and him getting the belt, he actually kept his boxing base and for the most part was knocking people out very early, utilizing his devastating punches. So in support for Francis Ngannou becoming a good boxer, one could argue that despite him becoming a mixed martial artist, he's for the most part utilized solely his boxing. Besides that one time against Cyril Gane, though still, it doesn't change the fact that boxing and MMA doesn't usually translate to boxing in the traditional sense, which may sound weird to some fans, as you would think that boxing is just another martial art that's added to another array of martial arts. So how would the boxing and MMA be different? And it's not really a matter of skill, it's a matter of just purely being different. Alright, let me try to explain this point with a story. Now, I was very fortunate enough to train with former Ultimate Fighter winner Jesse Taylor, who is a mixed martial artist, and I got to watch him spar the other guys in pure boxing. And obviously, skill-wise, he was just as good, if not better, than everybody else because he was a former professional, but it was clear that his boxing was just different. I feel like pure boxers can tell when they're fighting a guy that learned boxing through MMA because their style is much more loose, it has less sharp movements, they definitely slip and roll less, and their primary way to defend punches is just blocking. When it comes to their loose style, I think MMA guys, when they box, are still very loose because they're still used to accounting for a tie, clinch, or maybe a sprawl happening. And most MMA guys are not taught to slip and roll and have pretty defense like traditional boxers because there are knees and there are kicks that may deter somebody from doing that. So sorry for the little story tangent, but basically what I'm trying to say is that as good as Francis Ngannou's boxing is or may be in MMA, it's still vastly different from the boxing in traditional boxing, and he would need to adjust if he wanted to become a good professional boxer. So maybe Francis Ngannou doesn't have the best skills for traditional boxing, but that hasn't stopped a guy like Deontay Wilder, who doesn't necessarily have the best boxing skills, from becoming a world-class boxer and keeping up and knocking out some of the best heavyweight boxers in the division now. Similar to Deontay Wilder, Francis Ngannou always has the nuclear option, and I truly believe boxing or MMA, Francis Ngannou can knock out any human being with one punch. And despite me saying that Francis Ngannou does have less power than Deontay Wilder, I think he still exceeds a certain threshold in which he can knock out anybody in the heavyweight division in boxing. So for my Francis supporters, Ngannou can possibly take the Deontay Wilder route, in which he doesn't necessarily need to have elite boxing skill, he just has to have enough to keep up until the point he finds that opening with his big right or big left hand and wins the fight due to stoppage or a knockout. I think a lot of Francis supporters were pointing to this reason as to why Francis Ngannou can potentially be a good professional boxer, but there's one big hole with this strategy. Though Francis Ngannou and Deontay Wilder's power is very comparable, there is a huge difference between the two. and that's about 50 to 60 pounds of pure muscle. See, Deontay Wilder, despite being such a devastating knockout artist, is only about 215 pounds. With him being so light, Deontay Wilder is able to last 10, 11, 12 rounds even with some of the top boxers. Francis Ngannou, on the other hand, would be possibly carrying 50, 60, or even 70 more pounds of pure muscle over the course of 12 rounds, which he's never done before. He's been so used to training just high-intensity 25-minute fights that I don't think his body can even sustain those long 12-round fights. Joe Rogan explains it very well with Faraz, who is one of the GOAT MMA coaches and trained Georges St. Pierre, but basically, when somebody has a lot of muscle, it takes a lot of oxygen to supply those muscles, and that's why most muscle-bound fighters don't pan out well in the latter rounds of their fights. Now, Francis Ngannou doesn't necessarily have to go for the Tyson Fury route or any of the top heavyweights. Francis Ngannou can also possibly take another route in which he takes a bunch of tune-up fights to prepare him for the bigger fights in boxing. Now, I've explained this in older videos, so I won't go into much detail, but basically, stars that draw more fans and more money to certain events have more control in the opponents that they can fight. Francis Ngannou, being a very big star and obviously a huge name in combat sports, can lead him to possibly having control over the opponents that he faces, and he can adjust his boxing style to traditional boxing and then adjust his body to traditional boxing as well, probably losing a lot more muscle and getting his cardio adjusted to 12 3-minute rounds. But unfortunately, there's a problem with this strategy as well. Francis Ngannou is 36 years old. He doesn't have much time to stay in boxing and get those big fights because he eventually might get too old and his appeal to fight big names in boxing might go stale. Unfortunately for Francis, he doesn't have much time to take a lot of tune-up fights and adjust both his skill and his body to fight in boxing, and the idea of him fighting Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, the hype for those type of fights may die. So this finally leads us to the answer of the question in this video, which is, can Francis Ngannou become a good professional boxer? And the answer is probably not. That was pretty obvious probably for a lot of people watching this video and probably said no in the beginning of this video, but even with an in-depth answer, I still couldn't find a logical reason as to why Francis Ngannou can become a good professional boxer. And when I mean good, I mean, can he compete with guys like Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, or even Andy Ruiz, Dillian White, or Chris Arreola? I don't think he possesses the skill or body right now to compete with those guys, and I don't think, given his age, he has time to make those adjustments. So I think the best route for Francis Ngannou, considering he just turned down $8 million to fight John Jones, is to take a huge money fight against a guy like Tyson Fury and let that cover the cost of you not fighting in the UFC and possibly cover the cost of your career, period. Francis Ngannou, like I said before, is 36, and we could be looking at the tail end of his career. There's not that many other fighting organizations with elite heavyweights, and obviously he's not going to go back to the UFC, so this might be it for Francis. A couple money fights to sustain him for the rest of his life may look like the most realistic route for Francis. But what do you guys think? Can Francis Ngannou become a good professional heavyweight boxer, or is this it for him? Thanks for watching, guys, and thanks for the support as always. Peace.